Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Kurt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 94 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm back here with Jerry to continue our Big Idea series. And we're tackling a very small issue today, Jerry, of higher powers and experiences. And so I'm really excited to put the Trauma Informed Lens and nerd out about you a little bit. And for the first time in 94 episodes, on our outline that we use for this episode, psychedelics appears as one of the things to talk about. So I never thought I would put the trauma-informed lens on psychedelics, but hey, you do 94 episodes, you eventually get everywhere. So if you're just joining us maybe for the first time or haven't joined us in a while, we've been using Johnathan Haidt's The Happiness Hypothesis as sort of a quote-unquote light summer reading series we're doing, tackling big ideas, big research, and putting that under the trauma-informed lens. So it's been a fun kind of series. We have one more episode left. We have one more chapter to get through. So it's been fun talking about these issues. As always, Jerry, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week. And I wonder what is on your mind this week, my friend.
You know, it's hard not to have, and it's not a bright, shiny object, but the shootings around the country in El Paso and Daytona, and how it changes people's lives. But in both situations, which I was kind of happy to see, there was a lot of community outpouring of support. And I think that it's sometimes our biology of attachment when something threatens the group causes us to reconnect with each other, to kind of looking at that piece, to refuel, to refute. And I think that that need to kind of feel a sense of belongingness to increase safety and support for each other is really a beautiful thing. I've had the pleasure of feeling that around funerals and people who died in my own lives, or around community events that have happened. And it's really difficult because, the feeling at the time is, why can't we just keep this? Why can't we just hold on to this? And I think it's the biology. As we kind of move on and we kind of reestablish our sense of denial that there's threats out in the environment, we tend to explore and disconnect from each other, right? And I think that the really sense of security comes from knowing you can reconnect, not that you're always connected. So I hope as we create our community of learners out there with our podcast, that at times, periodically, we feel like we can come back and talk about difficult things or things that are challenging, and that we can establish that across the country, and in some ways internationally, to kind of look at that. So I want to send my deepest sorrows and condolences to the people who lost their lives, but also send my support to those people who are supporting others, with the message that it's important to titrate that as well, as to take care of yourself as you're taking care of others.
Absolutely. And again, I want to just echo that. I think, I found myself, maybe you could give me a little bit of advice here, Jerry. I'll take some free therapy as my bright, shiny object. Because I found myself, the outpouring of support that you saw, I think was really powerful. And I think it always is after these events. I guess I made the mistake yesterday of opening up Facebook. And I also see the I don't know if it's the opposite of that, but the them and us split just, I don't know. It's like we've lost the ability to talk. And I even found myself, usually after these, I try to write my elected officials and advocate for changing the laws that at least I believe, I won't get political here, contribute to these disasters. And I just couldn't do it one more time. Like, and I haven't given up, but it's just like, I think, on the other side of that, I wish we had a better forum to talk to each other. Cause I mean, I'm pretty much done with Facebook, especially after watching The Great Hack on Netflix. But I don't know. It was just really hard for me. As like, I found myself in a moment of just resignation, I guess. Like, what more could I do? I wanted to do something. I wanted to do it, and I just felt, I don't know. I froze, and I usually don't freeze. But I couldn't engage people that think differently than me. I couldn't write my representatives because it's just like it. I just think, okay, we're not going to do anything, and another one's going to happen, and we're gonna pray and send thoughts to people again. And I don't know. Do you have any advice for people like me who, again, you know me, I'm a fighter. I'll pick myself up and dust myself off and go back at it. But any advice for, I think probably a lot of us who are just so, I think, so down about this. Like we are inspired by the support and the resiliency of these communities, but I don't know that where is the change going to come from? Any advice for us, Jerry?
I guess I don't really have some good advice other than vote.
Yeah.
And get involved, and also understand that violence begins in childhood, and that when we can hold our children with compassion and sensitivity and regulation, we create resilient children. When we react to them, so that these kinds of issues are times to reconnect not only with other people involved, but other people in our own lives, and that you can make a difference. I think that the last piece really is to think about how you're violent in your own life, and what can you change about that. It's very hard when you're feeling somebody's attacking you. One of the things I was at the gym the other day, and I have a kind of an association with a gentleman. He's Hispanic, and he was a police officer in the LA police force. And he talked about how he grew up, he experienced prejudice, and he thought when he grows up, he's going to be different. And then he got into the police force, and he realized how fear and anxiety caused him to become prejudiced. He said, because he knows what I work on, he says, "What do you think about that?" And I said, it makes total sense that when you're exposed to those types of things repetitively, it causes people to react and changes their perception of the world. I would hope that we put the same compassion for children and families living in those communities that we do towards officers working in those communities.
Yeah.
And that we begin to make changes in the conditions people have to deal with that increases the likelihood that they won't, in some ways, respond to things with violence. And so really we can change some of this by changing things in our own community, by changing things in our own family, and by changing things within ourselves. That's the place to kind of make the change.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I think my unbright shiny object leads us into the first point from this chapter that I thought was Really interesting. I know Haidt really likes this topic of disgust.
It was disgusting.
Yeah. and he, in this chapter, approaches it from sort of a religious purity stance. But I, when I read his thing about one of the things that really came into mind for me, and again, I've been disgusted a little bit, as I shared just a second ago, with some of the reactions that I do see in certain corners of the internet and in our politics. But I wonder, when we put the trauma-informed lens on this, because I think even though, like, especially I think my work in homelessness, but also with poverty and other pieces as well, I think we do sort of have this untouchable class in our communities. And, I really, I thought it was interesting that he, on a chapter on divinity and higher power, really put forth the idea of disgust in this chapter, which I normally would not associate with William James's, religious experiences, and it's something that you wouldn't usually make my radar. But his sort of argument that a lot of times what religion does for us is helps us to overcome or at least integrate the animal side of ourselves. And I don't really have a question here, Jerry, but I just kind of wonder, as you read that, what kind of thoughts any thinking did that bring up for you? Because I just thought it was interesting he even put discussed in a chapter on spirituality and divinity.
What came to my mind when I was reading this, one is because it was hard to stick in there because it was so disgusting. But what came to my mind is how often in working with my clients, the concept of self-disgust comes up, of how when they look inside themselves and see themselves, that they feel disgusting, and really needing to separate that from that. Somehow, if you knew me, I would contaminate you with this piece, and really not being able to tolerate that, and trying to sort that out with this experience of shame, to kind of looking at that, and oftentimes in that process, with this breaking down of seeing the self as disgusting, is this conflict with their spiritual beliefs, that somehow they were betrayed, or somehow they're no longer worthy, or somehow. So that what he really talked about is sometimes our spiritual beliefs kind of protect us from that pieces of ourselves, helps us manage it. But I was thinking, well, in my clients who could not separate those things, that spiritual belief becomes almost a kind of critical component of the process, as opposed to a supporting part of the process. And how tough that is for them to kind of, in some ways, engage in a relationship again, because they can contaminate you with their disgust. And I really got into kind of trying to kind of understand, so what happens and what function does that serve, for this individual to kind of have that internal sense about the body. Because the healing takes place in the body. The spirituality is a healing process, as he talked about, of kind of morality and feeling connected to other people, right? But what happens when you look inside and that's the reaction you get? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it also made me think too, because a lot of times I think my work in the LGBTQ plus community, I just see, and with the relationship between disgust and faith, one of the things that I think is so hard for so many people with sort of coming out process is that they're then seen as, I wouldn't say less than human per se, but that they're they're treated as almost like that untouchable. I think a lot of people with traumatic experiences where, and we've talked a lot about this, they do things to survive. The guilt and shame of that, as I like to say is, for a lot of folks, trauma is a disconnection from the best of myself, relationships, and spirit for a lot of people is a huge part of that. And what really breaks my heart sometimes is there's that internal struggle with shame resulting from the traumatic experience. But so often when people get the labels of homeless or addict or, whatever labels criminal we put on them, it's like it furthers that disgust and shame inside of them. And I think if we step back and say, okay, and again, I think we're having in our country a conversation about how our mental health system is not adequate, which I think we would pretty much, there's universal agreement on it. Now, I think part of us want to fund it adequately and the other doesn't seem to. But it's like, how do we not only help the individual deal with their shame, but also create supportive communities where they can express themselves and their struggles without being judged as lesser than or untouchable, or that there's, something inherently genetically wrong with them as people too. And that's the other kind of piece of this that I think a lot of times, at least historically, and I think currently, religions have judged behaviors as disgusting, which I think put people in even a higher mountain to climb over their trauma into the recovery process with that.
I think his, first of all, some of his conclusions, almost like the fact that we eat meat, we're more vulnerable. Mm-hmm. That's one very strong belief system, right? But the reality of it is, prior to us being in agricultural societies, and we lived in really small groups, we had to hunt for food, and we took long times, we ate less, and we were actually less in some ways connected with other people because we didn't have a shared language. Mm-hmm. And so people were actually, their immune systems were actually stronger.
Yeah.
And somehow when we became an agricultural society, both eating meat and growing our food, we began to, in some ways, become much more status. There were people growing food. There were people who are paying people to grow food. There were people those people who are paying needed soldiers to protect them from anything. Is that we became much more, and that in itself created this kind of separation that we kind of hear in this class system. And I think that there's a lot that goes along with how our cultural beliefs about who's our in crowd and who's our not in crowd. As some of these political arguments are really surfacing in, is how do we kind of have somebody who's looks different, acts different, feel connected to them, right? It's very hard. And so we start to devalue them in some ways. And I think that, when you talk about homelessness and you talk about issues of sexual identity and gender identity and you talk about abuse, these are really hard things for people to kind of own and reflect upon in themselves. Mm-hmm. And so they take that internal conflict and then they fight it out there. And so those people become the bad people, and those people become the, almost like a protection. And I think he talked a little bit about how spirituality becomes a protective factor in a way to keep us from this disgust. Those people who are behaving that way disgust us because it's not morally acceptable in our group to kind of looking at those. And that could be a healthy thing and it could be an unhealthy thing, right? And I, as I look at our politics today, where does a healthy sense of narcissism allow somebody to elevate themselves and stand up and speak out and kind of do it? And where does narcissism become a pathology, where in some ways you have an exaggerated sense of self and you take responsibility for things that you have no responsibility for positively, but then blame everybody else for negative things. When does that become a negative thing, right? So it's not this is bad, this is good. It's somewhere on these continuums.
Yeah.
So spirituality is the same way, is that there's a healthy component to that. And then there's a part of it that can become an addiction that in some ways keeps us from connecting with things. So I think that he did a good job in this chapter of really getting us to really reflect on what is the function of all this, not only in our communities, but in ourselves.
Yeah. Well, that's why I thought this was like so timely for me to go through these two, reading this chapter yesterday morning and then clicking on Facebook to see the gun debate, because one of the things that I actively try to search out, and I mentioned this before, is I get disgusted by certain speech and certain actions in the political spectrum. I mean, I will own that. But I also really try to, and this is what I couldn't do yesterday, which I disappointed myself a little bit, is that when I see people that are different than me, and I feel that disgust, I want to reach out and connect, because usually when I do that, at least I understand the reason behind their thinking. And usually we don't agree at the end of those discussions. We stay sort of in our philosophical corners, so to speak. But what I'm trying to do is, if I have that gut reaction to somebody, to really get to know them in a different way and find a way to respect them as a person, even if I disagree with them as an individual. And I think, spirituality is an interest. Well, I think more religion than spirituality, growing up in a very sort of black and white, all or nothing Catholicism upbringing. We were pretty clear that if you weren't Catholic, your chances of going to heaven were pretty low, right? We were the one, like we were Jesus's home team. And I think that's where, whether it's a religion, which I think religion's trickier, or politics, we get so in our corner and we're right and everybody else is disgusting, that when we get to that point, I worry about a society. And that's where I think I'm really struggling is, I lost my ability to reach out to people who posted things different than I believe. And I think, I wish we had social media apps that brought people together in a way we can at least hear each other. And I think if we eliminate that disgust, it'd be better. One of the things that I find interesting about Washington, D.C. in our country right now is that a lot of people believe, and if you look at people that have been in Congress for a long time and you ask, hey, what's different today than, say, 20 years ago, when things seem to be a little less divided in our country? And the number one answer I always hear, and I'll be open, this is usually white men giving this answer, because I think there was this in kind of club there. So owning that, but the thing people say is, now in our political society, every free moment, I've got to go to my Republican headquarters or Democratic headquarters and raise funds. Before, I would go out to drinks with people on the other side of the aisle, and we would connect and we would know each other socially. And I think that's a good lesson for us. Not that you need to go out and get drunk with each other necessarily, but we've now lost in our politics that ability because of money. We've lost that ability to connect. And I think now I can be disgusted with you a lot easier because you're not the person. I think Cummings and another senator or a representative, when he was an African-American, jumped in and defended his friend who was a Republican and said, no, I know this guy is not racist because I know him. He's a good friend of mine. And I just think how rare that is in today's politics and social arguments as well. So it's like we got to find ways to connect with each other. But I don't know. I haven't come up with that app yet, Jerry.
That even that app, that's how Facebook started. Then it got out of control. So
Exactly.
And it's
Exactly.
become not so good.
Yeah. Let's just blame the algorithms, I
And
guess.
I also think Matt, is in running an organization is how do I encourage conflict around tasks and strategies and potential new views of seeing things, and then be very, very clear that somehow conflicts between people is destructive. Right? And so when we look at that, it's very difficult in today's world to make, are we really talking about tasks, or are we talking about conflicts between people?
Mm-hmm.
And politics seems to be much more about, I'm going to attack you, as opposed to we're engaged in a process of finding innovative solutions.
Right. Well, and my frustration is when I have these conversations with people, we agree, and my little entries into politics and community organizing, I've seen the same thing. We agree on so much. We agree. We just don't have a venue right now. We focus so much on the disagreements that we could probably get a lot more done if we sat down and say, okay, this is your line, this is my line. You're not going to go as far as I want to go. I'm not going to go as far as you want to go. But hey, there's like 40% of here that we would both vote yes on. Let's move forward on that 40%, and we can continue to argue about those other things. And that's where I think without our regulation, I think disgust gets us outside that window of tolerance pretty quickly. We're missing areas like that we could actually come together on.
So Matt, what do you think from a trauma-informed lens, we see these kind of behaviors when people's basic sense of security is threatened, right? And we see that when people's basic sense of security is threatened, they're very vulnerable to leaders who will step up and act in some ways in their own interests and kind of look at that. We're very vulnerable to becoming polarized. We're very vulnerable. So if we look at all this from a trauma-informed lens, what has made us more frightened as a society than we were 50 years ago?
Yeah. I mean, I think, if I were to look at that, I think one of the things is we don't trust our government anymore. I mentioned that Vietnam documentary where, kind of for one of the first times in our history, the majority of the population started not to trust their leaders. And I think when you don't trust your leaders, your sense of safety, the people that are, supposed to protect you, you can't trust anymore, and might be sending your sons off to die in war. I think that what is a big loss in that piece. And I think that the other thing that I really think with the trauma lens is that we don't, again, and this kind of goes back to my previous point, we don't have the relations with one another, that sense of community, so that we can have those healthy conflicts. Because I'm not in any way advocating for a conflict-free government. I think that that's a dictatorship, if not worse. So it's like, how do we, through our relationships, maintain a sense of emotional regulation so we can find areas where we agree and we can define our arguments with one another. And I think when we're not connected with the community, this is what I got, because I challenged myself to at least look at posts I don't agree with, is if you take my gun away, you're taking my security away. There was a post that honestly triggered me until I took a few deep breaths, is, well, if I was in that Walmart, I would have been concealed carry and I would have stopped it. I'm like, it was in Texas. It was, if there's, but, then I had to take a breath. But I think everything's sort of a like, we're going to take away your privilege. We're going to take away your security. All these brown and black people coming in is going to take away your life and your. So I think we get so heightened by our politicians then that there's threats. And I think one party does this really well in our country, gets people scared, and unfortunately that's a great motivation to vote. So, if you don't have community with black and brown people in your community, they might seem like a threat. If you don't talk to people and have that relationship, when we need to have conflict to find a medium ground, we end up yelling at each other. And so I just think that we're in this fight or flight. And as you've said so well in the podcast, episode after episode, without that community, how are we going to get back into our window of tolerance? And that's my worry.
So the question is, as always, there was a hypothesis presented. Mm-hmm. If I had guns, this event wouldn't have happened, right?
Yeah.
But we have that, and the question really is how many of those people that were at that Walmart today are gun owners?
Yeah.
Right? But we don't research these incidents because in some ways we don't want to find the answer, because what if we find the answer and the answer is guns keep us safe?
Yeah.
Or the answer is guns actually don't make us safer. I fall on that end, but I don't have any data to kind of look. But we don't really want to find the true answer to this problem.
Yeah.
So the issue is, I get disgusted by those people who say, if I had a gun, I would have done something. And they get disgusted by me saying, you know what, guns don't. We need to find a way to answer these questions.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just it's almost like we're in this escalating discussion and that I'm going to prove you right and you're going to prove me wrong. It's like, no, let's put a hypothesis out and test it.
Yeah.
But the United States government basically banned research on the impacts of guns in our country.
Yeah.
Right? And so we can't answer these questions.
Exactly.
And why did they do that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why do they not want us to answer these questions?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's, fight or flight, right? God forbid we get data. I mean, look at the climate discussion. And, there's plenty of data out there coming out from the White House, and yet, okay, let me move on to next, because I think this continues our discussion, but I really wanted to get your thoughts on this too. He brings out these three aspects of morality, which I think really fits in really well. He says that there's an ethic of autonomy, an ethic of community, and an ethic of divinity. And I thought, I've heard different aspects of this, out there, and sometimes they use different labels. I thought it was interesting is he kind of connected the ethics of autonomy with liberalism, which I think, living in Colorado, the birthplace of at least modern American libertarianism, it's like the autonomy seems to be totally that other end of the spectrum in my thinking. So I thought that was interesting, but I think this helps us kind of frame this discussion is, from the autonomy perspective, I think I have a right to be safe. But other people feel they have the same right and also have a sort of God-given right to carry weapons as well. And I think part of this conflict, reading this chapter again yesterday was great timing about, the rights or the ethics of the individual within that ethics of community. And I think this enters our political discussions as well, is the ethics of religion and spirituality. And, this mix, I think, can be really positive a lot of times, but I think, adding divinity into the mix of personal and community is an interesting way to look at this as well. And I just wonder, with this great discussion we're having, does that autonomy versus community, and even if we want to throw divinity in there, does that help sort of inform the thinking in any way shape or form when we kind of break it down into those boxes?
So when I read that, my association immediately went to Sandra Bloom's model of physical safety, psychological safety, social safety, and then moral safety.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Is that unless you're safe in all of those domains, you're going to in some way stay in a defensive state and not be open and curious and exploring new possibilities. And you end up seeing a two-dimensional kind of world in which, you're right and I'm wrong, or I'm wrong and you're right, as opposed to these others. So I think that how do we all, whether it's individual, stay physically safe?
Mm-hmm.
But then how do I stay safe within myself, that I could tolerate what I'm feeling, I could tolerate what I'm thinking, I can really integrate all of that, as opposed to try to deny it or get overwhelmed by it, or act out in some ways that is dangerous to somebody else or to myself. And then how do I feel safe in this social community, connected to people, right? And then what are the moral standards, whether that be spiritual or religious, that you use to guide us to, do I feel safe in that place? So that I think he kind of outlined a simpler kind of three-step model, but it fit well with what Sandra Bloom talked about trauma, is that traumatized individuals don't feel safe in multiple levels of that.
Yeah. And I thought it was interesting. This is kind of a nerdy thought that has been kicking around my head when I read the history and that sort of stuff. But also, when you look at the person, the community, and let's just say religious is that divinity, that sort of higher moral ground. I think modern society is so interesting because there used to be, and I'm even thinking, I don't know, 100 years ago, but pretty in our recent past, you had the vast majority of people within a community really exposed to one moral compass, so to speak. You sort of had one religious, even if it was Protestant or Catholic, it was rare that you said, you woke up on a Sunday and said, do I want to go to synagogue, a mosque, or where do I want to go kind of today? And now, we've sort of had this, and I think this is why he relates the autonomy piece with liberalism, is now we have different competing moral, templates and roadmaps that we bring into our communities now, that is much more diverse. And I'm one who celebrates diversity because I think your conflicts can lead to more innovation and better solutions. But I'm always fascinated with where we're at historically, is that whether you want to put religious on top of it or morality, that we have a lot of competing sort of moral frameworks to choose from. So you have evangelical Christians on one side, you got secular humanists on the other side. It used to be if you're a secular humanist, you might not live very long, at least if you express that belief. So I think it's interesting that the diversity might be behind a lot of our challenges. And my hope is that we come through the other end of this knowing how to gain the great benefits of diversity, instead of saying, nope, if you don't look like me, if you don't think like me, if you don't pray like me, you're not a part of my community. And I think that's an open question for what's going on in Europe right now, what's going on in America. I think that we're in an interesting point where these three things come together.
I think that's a good point, is that having some simplicity helps to say is I'm either in or I'm out, right? And now, you know, I don't even know how many gender categories there are anymore, right? It's like, how do I truly respect everybody when I don't even know what everybody, right?
Yeah.
So when does it become way more complex than I can kind of keep up with? So, and without being disrespectful, there's times I just don't really understand.
Yeah.
To kind of looking at that. But on the other hand, I think that what's it like for the individual in these that doesn't fit anywhere?
Right. Yeah.
That whatever happened to them, they can't disclose it and talk about it, so it stays inside. And so there's this separation, and so they don't feel physically safe. They don't feel psychologically safe. So they don't feel like I can own this piece. You know, you talk about, you know, in the community in which somebody's struggling with their sexual identity is by the time that struggle is verbal, they've reached another stage, but for so long it was internal and I can't talk. So what is it like to be part of a group but can't be part of a group?
Right. Yeah.
Right? What's it like to be in your community but not be a member of your community? Right? What's it like to, in some ways, hear all these social messages from the moral code that what's going on in you is unacceptable to us? Right? That's what trauma is about.
Yeah.
Right? That's what trauma is about. It's really about this disconnectedness, and that I can't access both internal resources to kind of manage this, but I'm also cut off from any kind of co-regulatory process.
Yeah.
That's there, right? And so I end up starting to see myself as separate, as not acceptable, as disgusting, as to kind of look at that. And then so in a way, how do we create opportunities for these individuals to come into feeling a sense of connectedness? But by doing that, you create stress on the other side of people who haven't managed it and feel like, oh my God, that's way too much for me. And it's conflicting we're going to create tension in our society just by creating more openness about these issues.
Absolutely.
Right? What does it do when I turn on my TV and I see two men kissing? I have a visceral response to that. Right? Doesn't mean it's bad or good. It's my visceral response. I've got to have the internal capacity to be reflective, to do it, not to act out or to disown. That takes a lot. So as we open up our society to make it more accessible, we're also opening it up for more conflict, for more tension, which requires a higher level of emotional, physiological, cognitive, moral regulation.
Yeah.
So we've down-regulated all those rules in doing it, but we've up-regulated what we have. So by very nature, we're creating a very, in some ways, activating environment. We have signs telling us sexuality is bad, but we have signs with provocative, people and models in their thing. Like, what do I do with this?
Yeah. Well, and it's. I just I got done looking at something about what Europe's going through in nationalism. I think in some ways it's going the country that sort of handles or the community or the culture that handles, because diversity is happening everywhere now. You even look at the paradises from the liberal perspective of Norway and Sweden. All of a sudden their countries aren't just. It's getting more diverse, and there's some struggles with that. And I think, it'll be interesting to see, I think, when we're old men looking back at this and saying, remember this conversation we had about who in some ways is able to create communities out of diversity that really might become the leaders of the next part of human history. Or the opposite reaction to that is we've got to go back to the sort of American first nationalism. Hey, if you're not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you don't belong in this country. There is a different stream of future that this could go, which you see a lot both in our country and in Europe. So I think it's this interesting time is this the last gasp of nationalism, or is there this counter reaction that's going to hold on a lot longer than I think some of us would like it to? So I think we're just at a fascinating point.
So aren't we talking about the issue of boundaries?
Yeah. Talk about that. Yeah.
We can have this metaphor, whether it be personal, that if my boundaries are so rigid, that protects me, but it also doesn't allow me to grow.
Right.
However, if my boundaries are so fluid, then I lose a sense of who I am and what I'm about and where are my needs and what are your needs, right? And so I think we're all struggling on multiple levels, and the metaphor is, do we build a wall?
Yeah.
Right? And we know with our clients how many of them come who have built walls.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Right? And it keeps them in some ways stagnant, and protection outweighs growth and restoration and kind of do it. But the risk of letting down the walls is I'll be just opened and overwhelmed and bad things are going to happen to me. Yeah. So I think we see these metaphors both in the individual, in our families, in our communities, in our societies, is that we're struggling. What is healthy boundaries?
Yeah.
And so we react by over creating boundaries, or there's some people going, let's open up our boundaries and anything can come in.
Right. Exactly.
Right. So I think it's a very interesting metaphor that we're dealing with that is very trauma based.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, let me cross one of my boundaries that and I've had this discussion. It's usually during one of my trainings, somebody will whisper this to me. And so I'm excited to spend at least a few minutes on this, because he does spend a lot of this chapter on kind of peak experiences, or I think what he calls elevation. So whether that's something connected to your spirituality, he uses, which I think my wife would love this because she loves her, people watching the Oprah Winfrey show. He uses one of this. He used one from my childhood, a video of Michael Jordan. I remember there was a music video with all his greatest hits on it that I watched like every day. So this elevated experience, but the whisper that I get at my trainings, I don't know if you've ever got this, Jerry, is, hey, have you heard about ayahuasca? Have you heard about MDMA? Have you heard about, Special K and some of there's this sort of underground, and where I've done a little bit of research, but I'm not going to claim expertise in this area, is one of my heroes in the trauma movement, Dr. Gabriel Mate, who's worked, and if you haven't read The Realm of Hungry Ghost, just go buy it now. I think it's especially if you're in public health, it's a must read. And he works with a lot of folks who've experienced heroin or other really tough drug addictions, experienced homelessness. A lot of his folks are living with HIV and a lot of other medical issues as well. And where we haven't necessarily had a lot of great success with people struggling with these severe addictions, he's getting some really good results of doing an ayahuasca trip and I think this is always important. It's not just like giving people ayahuasca, but doing it in a traditional way. And you're starting to see, I think, a very interesting movement is that some of these drugs that we have labeled bad, And we've thrown them over into the Schedule 1, Schedule 2, things like psychedelic mushrooms, LSD. And I will be a little courageous here and say I think we threw the baby out with the bathwater way too quickly. And I'm not saying, hey, let's put everybody on an LSD trip right now. We have to be very careful with this. But when you look at especially things that have a traditional healing context, like ayahuasca, I've been dying to ask you this question for a while. What are your thoughts on this? Because this is sort of even taboo to bring up. It's always whispered in my trainings, but I just kind of wonder, let's bring it out to the light a little bit. What are your thoughts on the psychedelics or other peak experiences as part of people's post-traumatic recovery process?
Well, I think, coming out of the 60s.
Yeah, you did go to Woodstock, didn't you? So,
I have multiple experiences, but like anything else, trauma is a shift in person's perceptions and kind of looking at it. And that there are certain cultures that have rituals and practices around the use of these psychedelics to kind of manage some of those. And one might say that even, the Native American dances and practices for re-experiencing the traumas of the battles and reintroducing them back into the tribe and the community. There was and smoking the peace pipe. There was a distortion of reality that allowed people in some ways to have an altered sense of who they were and how they were connected to things. But most of those were occurring within a connectedness to a larger group of people,
Kind of like that community and divinity coming
exactly.
together.
And in Don Juan's famous books, he had one of his books where the use of psychedelics was an important component in opening up one's awareness as an alternate way of looking at things. But he also said that's not the end of the journey. That's just a step in the journey. So I think as there's research done around trauma and the use of these, we have to be open to looking at that, right? And we also have to understand that not everybody is in a spot to benefit from those experiences, right? So when you say we threw is that anytime we get to a spot where we go, now we have the answer, it's usually not the answer because it's not the answer for everybody. But that there, in the 60s when there was this kind of really love and connectedness movement, psychedelics was a big piece of that, right? And we know that people really benefited from that. But we also know people had really bad trips and were hurt by that. So as we kind of look at these kinds of issues, I think the question really is, what is the benefit and in what conditions and for whom would these things benefit?
Yeah. And I think the fact that we are sort of opening up this research, I think it's going to be very slow to get there because there's, again, I've heard things about, again, ketamine and ecstasy and a lot of some of these MDMA that are now being clinically studied. And I hope we get, because I think, you kind of share my mentality. We got to find things that work for this individual, right? And I think, with the extreme kind of symptomatic stuff that, whether it's homelessness, whether it's a kid in juvenile justice or in the criminal justice, we've got to be very innovative and kind of bring, okay, what's going to work for this individual? And again, we're always going to be trying some stuff. And I'm one that's saying, hey, if we're going to try to give someone a psychedelic, we got to have some perimeters to make sure that that's going to be at least we've got a maximum of a safe experience. But I think, again, that intersection of community, divinity, and a pharmaceutical intervention, I don't know. I mean, we seem fine with people taking very harsh pharmaceutical and psychotropic medication with their breakfast in the morning. So, I think it's if nothing else, a good thought experiment is, hey, what if Mata is right about that ayahuasca trips under the right circumstances is incredibly effective for people with severe addictions? What does that mean for our thinking? And I think, unfortunately, so many of us say, well, that's great that he's getting these great results, but there's no way we can do that. And I think just to kind of think about, okay, again, do we have some stuff with that, bringing a little bit of that baby in bathwater back? Are there some good we can take out of there? Because I think that there is a peak experience with some of these, whether it's a psychedelic. I love, and I kind of wish I had access to this community, even though I'm a horrible dancer, but the whirling dervishes, I think I'm saying that right. Forgive me if I'm not, but this Muslim sect who does this beautiful dancing, and it's rhythmic dancing and drumming, where that gets them into their peak experience. I think mindfulness meditation can get you there, but I think it's really, for somebody with extreme trauma, it might be hard for them to get there. Yoga for some people gives them the Kundalini experience. So I think for a lot of folks, because trauma has beaten them down so much, that a peak experience helps them again. And I think you said this better than I will, kind of shift their reality for a period of time. And that shift might be the thing that gets them thinking in a different way about themselves and their world.
So an example is sexuality creates a peak experience. Mm-hmm. It also hurts people really seriously, right? The same intervention with different people outside the ground could really hurt to kind of do it. So I think when we read these types of interventions, we really have to be careful to kind of look at, but there's some belief is that when you have a ritual and a practice that you believe in and can convince the other person that who believes in you, therapy is a journey that they're going on with you, right? And periodically there's this peak connectedness, these moments of now where you and your client connect in a way that's outside the realm of your theoretical orientation, and outside is that there's these real connections that happen to kind of look at those things create change, right? And so if we can create experiences, heightened experiences that can create significant changes in people in a positive way, we should be open to looking at them and exploring them. But we should not get so caught up in to say, oh, good, let's put a tab of this in our water so that now we're all in that state.
It'd be interesting to try that for a day. I
was at Woodstock, so yes.
Let me ask you just one more. I don't know if this is a quick question or not, but I think it was an important piece of this, because one of the things he connects with is these peak experiences with the vagus nerve, and how when people talk about religious experiences, a lot of times they'll point, and he does this from a pretty nerdy research perspective, is it's coming from the heart, that it's not sort of a brain. And if you look at some of the research around psychedelics, it's like, oh, it opens your mind up. And actually the research says it actually kind of shuts pieces of your brain down and slows them down. So in some ways you're focused in a different way. And, we've talked a lot about vagus, the vagal nerve and heart rate variability. And the thing that when he said under the trauma-informed lens is that so many people, when they have these life-changing peak experiences, it really comes from the heart. That's where, and some traditions might call this the soul, but usually they're talking about something that comes kind of from the chest and not the brain that we kind of associate with that thinking part. And as we've talked about, the heart and the brain are intimately connected and are connected in so many cool ways. But the one thing that kind of, worried me about that when he said that, because I don't disagree with him that that's sort of a deep experience that goes beyond intellect, so to speak. And if it's coming from the heart, and the vagus nerve is, we know the health of the vagus nerve for a lot of our folks is pretty impacted by trauma. And I just kind of, as sort of a question to lead us out, when he talks about that heart experience of spirituality, divinity, peak experiences, it may be a complex question, but I'll just throw it out there. Do you think the damage done by trauma makes it harder for some of our folks to connect with this? So when I go out to nature, I can kind of feel a sense of connection, a deep sense of connection, and those sort of things. Do you think, some of our folks might be robbed of those peak experiences because of the neurobiological damage done by trauma?
What I get is a peak experience is you're well integrated. Mm-hmm. That you're connected to what's happening in your body, what's happening into your brain, and you're present and open to the experience that's coming at you, right? That's called integration. Daniel Siegel would call it integration, kind of looking at it. So to kind of label it, it's your heart, it's your brain, it's all the above.
Yeah.
Right? It's all the above to kind of do it, right? And so in trauma, people get oftentimes afraid of their bodies. What's happening in their body is not a safe place to go, right? Being internally reflective is not a safe place to go. And so it's hard to be open to what's happening in the moment and to be integrating sensations and emotions and thoughts into your experience. And so, there's a lot of thought of good trauma therapy is about getting out of your head and getting into your body. Mm-hmm. And that takes a process. It takes a process of feeling safe in the moment. Stephen Porges talks about immobilization with safety is an ideal place to go, but that's a very vulnerable, scary place, right, for people who are vulnerable. And so you work in therapy for this individual to be able to be with you in a way that they're immobilized, but they're safe, as opposed to they're shut down or they're hyper aroused, to kind of looking at that piece. So one could look at that these peak experiences is that when we feel safe in our bodies and we feel safe in our surroundings and we feel confident in where we are and what we're doing, we are open to these experiences. And trauma robs people of that ability to feel safe in the moment. That's part of it, is that their bodies automatically react to what happened in the past, and the signals they get of danger cause them to get defensive and in some ways project what they anticipate is going to happen as opposed to what's actually happening. And so that could either be this flood of emotions, or it could be this disassociation, shutting down of multiple kinds of brain regions and disconnecting from what's happening in the heart and the body.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a great, boy, we have covered a lot today, my friend. So what I love about this book, it gives us plenty of topics. So everybody out there, take care of yourself. This has helped me. I appreciate it, Jerry. Any last words on this topic?
I think that, one of the things that Dr. Perry talks about is that there's nothing innately bad about stress. Yeah. But when stress is moderate, predictable, somewhat controllable, it builds resilience. And so as we, in some ways, delve into these issues in our own lives and in our lives as a family or a community, is how do we titrate it so we feel a sense of control, we feel a sense of in some ways that this is something I can manage, it's moderate, and that really we're working for something collaboratively better than what we have here. And I think that allows us to create health-creating stressful situations as opposed to creating vulnerability. Excellent. So as we deal with these things in the news, as we deal with this, is really how do you titrate this in your own life so that you grow from these experiences rather than getting overwhelmed.
Excellent. Great way to end. So great discussion, my friend. I want to thank everybody as always for joining us. You can find some show notes, discussion questions as always at traumainformedlens.org. We have one more chapter to do in our series, so we'll come back and tackle one more big idea. I think he's going to reveal the secret of happiness, Jerry. So we'll share that with you next week. So thanks, everybody, as always, for listening, and have a great week. Take care of each other. Bye-bye.